Vladimir Putin has his eyes on NATO. He has his eyes on the United States, and he has his eyes on Europe to try to figure out what are they going to do, what might they do next. He's obviously aware of what they've done up to this point in this now 3.5-year war with Ukraine, and trying to figure out how this is all going to be resolved. And probably as important as anything, can we avoid an escalation? That's the one thing that I'm most concerned about. And I know that our guest on it is today. And we're really happy to have Glenn Diesen. Doesn't need an introduction to most of our audience. You guys have been, many of you have been begging for us to have him on for a long time. Glad we finally got that done. Professor of political science at University of Southeast in Norway, if I'm saying that correct. Professor, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me on.
I've been honored to be on your show a few times, and glad to finally have you back on ours. So one of the things we want to just get right into, because it's one of the things I noticed when President Putin made a really big speech we covered a little bit of at the Valdai conference, is that I saw that you were actually there. You were one of the people who actually asked a question at one point. So it's not just something, well, there he is right there. Yeah. So that was really cool. I was going, yeah, I know that guy. So that was really interesting. But I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to be invited to this. Have you been coming to these for years? How's that worked out?
Oh, I've been there every year for the past, I think, 5 years. Well, it began more than a decade ago when I wrote a book called Russia's Geoeconomic Strategy for Greater Eurasia. So I wrote back in 2015 that I assumed Russia's main strategy forward would follow essentially what it's doing today. I wrote a geoeconomic theory on how it would likely, to some extent, emulate the American system of the early 19th century by pursuing technological sovereignty, its own transportation corridor, financial sovereignty. But all of this required it to pivot more towards China and Asia. Anyways, in this Greater Eurasia Initiative, the book, I had the Putin's advisor on Eurasia, a man named Professor Karaganov, write the forward. And later on, I went to work in his institute in Moscow. Anyways, long story short, that same institute also manages a journal called Russian Global Affairs, where I'm also an editor, and they also manage the Valdai Discussion Club. So it's kind of same group of people.
So what is the temperature like for you in Norway, as opposed to, say, the United States or Great Britain or something? If you say too much about Russia, then you're often accused of being a Putin puppet and all this kind of stuff. But you've been doing this for quite some time. I just wonder how the people in Norway react to somebody who wants to cover the Russian side. Well,
it doesn't go down well, but it's not unique to Norway. It's you see this across Europe. It's very. I don't understand how we ended up in this place, but it's part of a wider, more dangerous development. That is, whenever you want to promote security in the international system, that is, you have to manage the security competition between the great powers. But to do this, the first step always is to have some empathy, put yourself in the shoes of the opponent. How do they see the world? You don't have to agree with it, but you have to see the world from their position. What I noticed over the past few years is we stopped doing that altogether. We more or less began to organize under the assumption that all of our adversaries, not just Russia, but China, Iran, anyone else, they don't really have any security concerns requiring us to discuss. Rather, it's all just happening in vacuum because they're bad. Now, I think this comes from the whole assumption that the world is divided between liberal democracies and authoritarian states. So even discussing the security concern of our opponents is a form of legitimizing it. So this was the first thing I really picked up on, because I moved away from Norway for 20 years and I came back and I noticed that as soon as you try to explain the security concern of our opponents, they would say, well, now you're legitimizing it, you're supporting them. So you end up in this strange situation where our enemies or adversaries are just evil and they want to do bad things. And the problem is, if you think that all your enemies are the most recent reincarnation of Hitler, peace requires us to defeat them on the battlefield, and any negotiations becomes appeasement. That's pretty much where we are in Europe now. That is, when you have people like NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg arguing, well, peace means more weapons is the path to peace, and we can, and under no circumstance can we actually sit down and talk to our opponents. I mean, in this country, we have 169 members of parliament. All 169 are for sending weapons, and none of them are talking about sitting down and talking with the Russians. Now, for me, this is complete insanity. How is it possible? No one wants any diplomacy. Everyone thinks that sending weapons to fight the world's largest nuclear power is the only path to peace. It's quite crazy, but all the media falls in line with this. But the root cause, I think, is this assumption that
and did this precede, or did it flow from February 2022 invasion into Ukraine? How did that play into? Did that accelerate it, or did it predate that?
Oh, I think it accelerated it, but it was there before then. So, but I really don't understand it. I find it to be, just it makes it impossible in my job, because if you try to teach international security, there's no way to do it if you can't discuss your opponent's security concerns. I mean, from my perspective, for example, I think that it's in Iran's interest now to develop nuclear weapons, to have a powerful deterrent.
That's not very popular.
I always make the point. I hope, really hope that they will not do so, because I think this will be incredibly unstable. But it should be possible to put yourself in the shoes of the other side and recognize that. What are their security concerns? Well, Israel and the U.S., backed by the Europeans, will likely not stop before they have defeated Iran. So they need a powerful deterrent. Now, I should be allowed to put myself in their shoes in order to make predictions about where they might go and the consequences of our policies. It doesn't mean that I want them to have nuclear weapons. I think that would be very, very dangerous. But the mere idea that you can't even discuss what their interests are, it makes it impossible in Europe now to have any sensible discussions at all, because the only thing you can say is, well, the reason why Iran wants powerful ballistic missiles is because they hate the Jews, or they want to destroy us, or they're terrorists. There's no discussion of competing security interests. It's quite extraordinary.
I'd like to ask you to go back a ways. Let's go back to the 2007 Munich Security Conference, where Vladimir Putin was actually invited to speak. And he had some pretty strong comments that were raised a lot of eyebrows, but it wasn't shocking. It wasn't like, an in-your-face or anything. But I guess at that time, correct me if I'm wrong, there was a willingness to listen, coming out of the Cold War as we were. Now, at that point, a little over a decade. But he was invited to the Munich Security Conference. What did you observe at that time, and how do you see that transition from there? And did the 2008 attack into Georgia, or military engagement with Georgia, depending on who attacked who, did that change things?
Well, I think it had a huge change, but you can bring it back further, because after the Cold War, we actually had disagreements with Russia to create a pan-European security architecture. That is the 1990 Charter of Paris for a new Europe. But then in the 90s, we decided to expand NATO instead. What's interesting is both Yeltsin and then Putin said, we could join NATO. If this is going to be the main institution, we can join. But they got the cold shoulder. They tried to, on several occasions, advocate for a pan-European security architecture. Nothing happened. And then by 2007 in Munich, this is really the main speech which came from Putin, where he said, listen, this is unacceptable. We can't accept that one center of power in the world will dictate to everyone else. And essentially creating two systems, one rules for the West and another for the rest. Like, this is going to end up in war. And even it wasn't even framed as people demonize it as anti-American, but he also made the point that for the hegemon, it would start to tear away at them as well, that this wouldn't be in their interest in the long run either. So I think that was a key warning in 2007. And again, they said, stop expanding NATO. We have to find a common solution, an inclusive European security architecture based on indivisible security. So one side not enhancing its security at the expense of the other. because what he was going after in Munich was the concept of unilateral or a unipolar system, and that means security as one side dominates so much it doesn't matter if the others complain. This is what he was
and
going
obviously that fell on rather deaf ears, because the very next year at the NATO Bucharest summit, they added Ukraine and Georgia to the aspirational mix. Do you have any idea or any understanding of why from 2007, when Putin was invited to the Munich Security Conference, the very next year, they went something that they knew was going to be an emotional issue for Russia?
It's quite extraordinary because, well, everyone heard the speech, but if you remember the media back then, they kind of brushed it off as, he's a bit authoritarian. He, because what he calls unipolarity, we just call liberal democracy flourishing. So it was dismissed. But you're right. In April of 2008, where NATO had the Bucharest summit, and what they did was offer future membership for Ukraine and Georgia. And then by August, there was a war. Indeed, if you read about it on paper today, they suggest Russia attacked, but the EU actually had an independent investigation, and they found that no, there was the Georgians who attacked first. So
Saakashvili took some pretty provocative action, because I think he thought he had NATO over his shoulder.
He definitely thought so. But what was extraordinary, because today everyone's kind of, even 2008, they brush it off as Russia was never worried about NATO expansion. But back in those days, you had WikiLeaks showed that both the French and German ambassadors warned that this could start a civil war, and even a Russian military intervention into Ukraine. Angela Merkel said that offering NATO membership to Ukraine would be like a declaration of war against Moscow. You had the CIA director, who was then the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, William Burns, arguing the same. It would likely trigger a civil war, and the Russians would then intervene on the side of the East Ukrainians. So this was very, very, very predictable. You also had people like Robert Gates in his memoirs writing that this was really overstretched, trying to get Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. Why not? It would be a little bit like Russia trying to establish a military alliance with bases and missiles in Mexico. It wouldn't be acceptable under any circumstances to the United States. So this was people knew that this was very dangerous. So
then why did we go down it? Why did the West, Europeans and the United States go down that path?
I have no idea. It's I think it's this incrementalism. They don't let Ukraine in right away, so they didn't give it a membership action plan, but instead it's this gradual things, like first toppling the government in Ukraine, because it's a key problem that the large majority of Ukrainians didn't want to be a part of NATO. Indeed, you had a lot of polls in 2008. It showed that the majority did not want to be a part of this. Even NATO had a report coming out all the way back in 2011, where it said that a lot of polls at best show that merely 20% want to join NATO. And this is very problematic for the future of the alliance in Ukraine. This was seen as a problem, but after the coup in 2014, it became this incrementalism, slowly taking over Ukrainian intelligence services, key government positions, the economy, beginning to cancel the Russian language, religious rights. So in order to put Ukraine into the NATO orbit, it did require some very fierce interference into society, but also the gradual buildup of a powerful Ukrainian army. I mean, one soldier at a time. And as it became more and more powerful, the assumption was that, I guess, Russia just have to learn to live with the new status quo. And the more, they can complain all they want, but at the end of the day, the reality is that there will be a very powerful Ukrainian army there with hundreds of thousands of men armed to the teeth by NATO. So there's nothing they can do anymore. We're just gonna have to learn to live with this new reality. But
we've had Larry Johnson on our show a number of times talking about how in the years prior to that, even the U.S. administrations prior to the 2022 war, both Obama, then Trump, and then Biden were continually building up the Ukrainian armed forces and doing NATO exercises, et cetera. There was, I think, like the sixth or seventh most exercises on the soil of Ukraine, as opposed to any of the actual members of Ukraine, of NATO, if I have that number correctly. Do you have any sense for What was that? What had been the result of that in terms of the tangible on the ground for the Ukraine military? How big is your understanding of what they were on the eve of the special military operation?
The size of the Ukrainian army.
Yeah.
I'm uncertain about the numbers, but they were growing, but also capabilities. But the important part is also that NATO was getting more and more entrenched into into Ukraine. And I remember back in 2021, you have the George Beebe, who's a former director at the CIA for Russia analysis. He was giving an interview pointing out that Russia's being put in this is the last point it has. If it waits much longer, it's not going to be able to do an intervention to change this tide. So soon it will have greater risk not intervening by intervening. So there was a lot of developments there where Ukraine began to be hitched de facto becoming a NATO member. So, for example, I think it was November of 2021, the U.S. and Ukraine signed this strategic agreement. At that point, the top advisor of the former French president said that this convinced Russia it either had to attack or be attacked. So given then 3 months later, Russia actually attacks, and we all come out with this narrative, oh, this was unprovoked. They just want to restore empire. Putin is Hitler. It was very, very dishonest from the first step, and this is the danger of it. By not giving any context what the Russians were after, there's no possibility of finding a peace agreement.
Well, and that is the problem. That's kind of where we are right now. And if I think that it's very much defendable to make an argument that we took lots of actions that would any nation, any state would have regarded as provocative. We don't seem to be doing a lot of things a lot better. Since the war actually started, our actions have only exacerbated and deepened the war, but not provided even the possibility of an actual military success on the Ukraine part, because in my view, it is just systemically not able to do so, mainly because of the manpower issues and balance on each side, and the industrial capacity and certainly the will on both sides is irrevocable on the Russian side. That was been my view, that no matter what the West and Ukraine brought to bear, they're never going to have, without foreign armies, they're never going to have the ability to flip the situation and drive Russia out, especially one that wouldn't cause it to go nuclear, which was always one of our issues here. But in my view, in the last, I'll just pick a number, 6 months or so, I think we're even more taking decisively negative actions that will harm Ukraine and are going to harm our own interest, and maybe even lay in the foundation for Russia to eventually succeed. Here's specifically what I mean, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. This one where Trump said the other day, a month or so ago now, a few weeks, that, you know what, I've now decided that Ukraine can go back to its 1991 borders, and now the conditions exist to do that, and after all, Russia is a paper tiger, so we can probably get this done. In response to that, at the Maidan conference, President Putin was asked about the paper tiger comment.
And he is teasing, saying that it is a paper tiger. A paper tiger? I already said that Russia all these years has been fighting not with the armed forces of Ukraine, not with Ukraine, but practically with all the NATO countries. And everywhere the Russian troops are confidently, I want to emphasize this, holding the strategic initiative. But if we are fighting against the whole NATO bloc and are still moving, advancing, feeling confident, and this is a paper tiger, then what is NATO itself? What does it then represent?
Now, when you look at the industrial capacity, when you look at the weapon stockpiles on the Russian side, where they have come, like say in the last 2.5 years, because it took them a good 1.5 years or maybe even 2 years, maybe even more than that, to really get up to their industrial capacity where they're cranking out. We're still back where they were, incrementally different. So if you want to talk about, a potential clash between the two sides, we are absolutely, as a bloc, the entire West is not prepared to actually get into a conflict with Russia. If something bad were to happen, Russia would have the upper hand. The military that they have, the experience that they have, but also all the things that go into making combat power. Why then would we want to go down a path and keep pushing something that, in my view, can't succeed?
No, it's a great question, and The former advisor of Zelensky, he kind of made a comment on this. I think it was 2 days ago. He was asked what he would do if he wins the presidency. He was making the point. Well, I would go straight to Moscow. I would promise that Ukraine would never again become a threat against Russia, and I would make territorial concessions and find political agreements. Restore the rights of Russian speakers. Essentially, what should have been done a long time ago. Now. The reason why they went down this path, I mean, I think they were fooled. What we don't reveal in our media is that on the first day after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as you can go on the Ukrainian government's website and see, Zelensky confirmed that the Russians contacted him on the first day to start talking about restoring Ukraine's neutrality. And on the third day, they agreed that they would hold talks. And based on restoring neutrality. We don't mention this in our media because that kind of undermines our narrative that this had anything to do with NATO. But my point is, we thought we could destroy the Russian, strategic defeat, as we have defined as an objective. But again, everything failed. We were going to defeat them militarily, if you remember. But as you say, they produce way more than all of NATO combined. That's not much of a paper tiger. They're also defeating NATO. We have lost all our military equipment. They have exhausted and depleted the whole Ukrainian army. So we can't defeat them. Even economic, we thought that sanctions, this would crush Russia because, their gas station masquerading as a country, their economy is smaller than Spain, like all this nonsense, which is not true. Instead, we see that Russia's not only held it economically, they're growing now faster than most of the Europeans, and they're now the fourth largest economy in the world in terms of purchasing power parity. And by the way, we're also going to isolate them in the international system so they will become a pariah state. They're not. They're hosting BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They're forming all this new partnership. They're essentially becoming, with China now, one of the main two countries spearheading the rise of this multipolar world.
Well, in fact, and I'm sorry, I want to pick down on that part because that's another thing that President Putin did say at the Vladimir conference, and he was directly asked, the West is trying to undermine Russian culture and society from within with all of these measures. Here's what he said.
Despite all attempts to corrode our Russian society from within, our opponents are achieving no result. But on the contrary, they are getting the effect opposite to what they expected. And the fact that young people have such an internal protection from any attempts to influence public consciousness from within, this is very good. This speaks to the maturity and solidity of Russian society.
So he's talking about the effect on the Russian society. It's had the opposite effect, but you can also say that economically and internationally, instead of making Russia militarily weaker, which you may recall with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, he said that was one of our outright objectives, was to weaken and harm Russia. We've had the opposite effect. Now then, they were somewhere around 1 million active total forces on the eve of the invasion. Now it's about 1.5 million. It will be at the end of this year. Their experience level, they have burned through a lot of their bad leaders that they had, a lot of their bad doctrine. It's now been replaced with the most modern, way more than we have in terms of experience. They've developed entire new categories and classes of weapon systems. They've learned more things about electronic warfare. They've learned how to defeat American missiles and Western armor on the battlefield, et cetera, things that they didn't have any knowledge about. So in every way you want to look at it, it's actually strengthened them and weakened us. Our stockpiles are now dwindling across the entire alliance, the United States in particular, because not only are we still helping Ukraine with stuff, but now we're sending all kinds of stuff to Israel, etc. We've used some in the Red Sea against the Houthis. God forbid, but we may be ready to do something in Venezuela. We don't have the kind of weapon systems and stockpiles, whereas Russia is bigger. So everything we have tried to do is demonstrably backfiring. Why do we keep going down that path?
I really don't know, because, again, the backfiring, I think, is the key here. I mean, security-wise, our military stockpiles are depleted. Our military alliance is falling apart. Economically, again, the Russians are growing. And in Europe, Europe is deindustrializing. its economies are falling apart. Also, if you remember back in the March of 2022, Neil Ferguson, he wrote in Bloomberg after interviewing American and British officials, and he wrote that, well, the conclusion is that the only acceptable end game now is regime change in Moscow to this. This is why they wouldn't accept any peace that wouldn't include regime change. Well, Putin's never been more popular. He's got his approval rating in the 80s. Meanwhile, in Europe, countries left and right, they're talking about canceling or banning the opposition party. They're doing this strange lawfare. Again, from France, Germany, Romania, across the board, they're doing everything.
I'm sorry, let me interrupt you for a second, because I want to ask you this before you get off of it. This idea of regime change in Russia, I wonder if you can talk, because you've been studying this for a long time. My impression is that if somehow they had been successful and gotten Putin out, whether it's caused from popular discontent or whatever, that anybody else who's in that orbit that might replace him would not exactly be more Western friendly. How would you see that?
No, I've been making that argument for a long time. I think it was back in 2015 or 16. I wrote an article for Australian think tank when I lived in Sydney. You know, the title of the paper was Putin as the last pro-Western leader of Russia. And it was meant to be sarcastic. I was just making the point that we often think in the West, when we daydream about regime changing Russia, that the alternative will be some opposition mounting on the liberal side, you know, to get another Yeltsin, someone who can't just wait to bow to the West and do as they're told again. But my main point is the main opposition, and I cited some generals coming along who were quite, beginning to come with some criticism against Putin. But the main criticism was we're being weak, showing too much, being too conciliatory towards the West. They see this as weakness, being restrained. And he was making the point, NATO is preparing Ukraine for future war with us. Why are we trying to make peace and fix the problems? We should be preparing for war. And this was the main conflict. And that was kind of the point in my article, again, a decade ago, that the main opposition comes from the more hawkish side. And so be careful what you wish for. If Putin goes away, I mean, look what's happened over the past 3.5 years. Every time we introduce something new, tanks, HIMARS, F-16s, we're doing long-range strikes. We're always, we can cross any red line we want. Well, this is where the criticism does come towards Putin. If you get rid of him, who do you think is going to come and replace him? You're not going to like it. You should be happy that Putin is there. There's no this idea of some mythical figure on the liberal side who will replace him. It's absurd. We're believing in our propaganda. Yeah,
we indeed are. And in fact, it's not limited to that. You mentioned, this absurdities of 3.5 years of disastrous or contradictory policies that have strengthened Russia and weakened our side. You would think, I would hope, that at some point we start saying, okay, oh snap, we've screwed this up. We can't admit it, but we got to start doing whatever we can to change this, because we keep going down all these things we've done economically, militarily, support Ukraine. It's all worked against us. Let's start bringing this thing to an end. That's what I would have expected any just self-interested party to do. But instead, this just yesterday, from General Jack Keane, talking on the U.S. on Fox News, talking about what we should do now at more than 3.5 years into this war, despite all of this wreckage of failure of all these policies I just mentioned. He says this.
Putin is steady. He's deliberate. He's ruthless, to be sure, but he's not reckless. These are deliberate, methodical moves that he is making to undermine the United States' will and resolve, and undermine the Europeans' will and resolve. That's what he is really about here. And we've got to stay focused on it. We've got to upgun the Ukrainians militarily, and some of those decisions have been made last week, and that's all good. We can't get into the specifics of that. And I still think we got to foreclose on the sanctions and the tariff, slap them hard in terms of anybody that's purchasing oil, certainly from the Russians. That obviously is That obviously is China, it's Iran, it's a whole bunch of other countries that are helping to finance this and arm them for sure. But the reality is we have got to get tougher militarily and also economically to put real pressure on Russia.
I mean, more than 3.5 years in, he's going to tag that out by saying we need to get tougher militarily and we need to get tougher economically. Like everything in the work, we just need to do it harder and a little bit more, and then we're going to turn it around. What do you say when you hear that kind of stuff?
Well, it's doubling down on stupidity. And I mean, there used to be more common sense before. I mean, even Obama back in 2016, he warned that, we don't want to send too many weapons here and escalate the conflict out of control. And for two key reasons. The first is the proximity. Russia is much closer in terms of logistics. They will have an advantage in terms of escalation control. And we've seen this. He didn't mention the industrial capabilities. But also another thing is it's more important for the Russians. For the United States, most people probably not quite sure where it is on the map, but among regular people at least. But for the Russians, this is seen as being an existential threat. They will fight this till the end. If nuclear weapons are required, they will do this because this is, again, they're seen as a threat to their existence. So the idea that if we can just up the ante, put some more pressure, a bit heavier weapons, no, I think all that's going to do is make sure that we get pulled further into this, and we're going to risk a direct war. And again, what is they speak in these cliches, get tougher, stronger. What exactly is the objective here? How are we going to enter this war? I mean, are we going to give long-range missiles, which are going to be operated by our soldiers? At some point, this likely won't have much to say on the battlefield. And if it does, if it looks like Russia might be losing, again, I think then they will reach for the nuclear weapons. There's no way they can lose this war. This is seen as a war for their survival. I mean, you don't want to win this war either. So it's quite extraordinary. After 3.5 years, they depleted all our weapon depots. They destroyed the entire Ukrainian army. And our solution is, well, let's maybe sit down and learn how to live on the same continent. No, we're going to get tougher on them. I mean, it's just, beyond absurd.
And one of the things that Keane referenced there, which I think that he meant without naming specifically, he says, well, I think we have done something recently, or he goes, at least privately it has been. We'll see if it comes out. I think he was talking about the discussion of U.S. Tomahawk missiles, which have a range in some cases up to 1,500 miles. That's way more than anything else, even the ATACMS, Storm Shadow, et cetera, that's out there right now, which would give Ukraine, theoretically anyway, the ability to strike deep. But as many people have been pointed out, and certainly the Russians did, that to use the Tomahawk, you would either have to use American missile carriers, ships, submarines with launch capability, or a very limited number of hardcore launch tubes, etc., which only we can operate. You can't just give the missiles to them and they can fire. They don't have the capacity to do that. And so I think it was also at this Valdai that Vladimir Putin was asked about that very topic.
Will this pose damage to our relations? Where we see light at the end of the tunnel, of course. Using Tomahawks without direct involvement of the U.S. officers is impossible, which means a brand new stage of escalation even between Russia and the U.S.
Well, so let's just take a look at that. Our better question is, what do you think Russia would do in the event? I don't think this is going to happen, by the way. I think for our own reasons, I think it's just something that Trump was going to be talking about. He said in the Oval Office, I think it was yesterday, that, well, I've kind of made my decision, but I want to see what they're going to use them. If you ask any of those questions, I think you'll say, yeah, that's a dumb idea. We're not doing that. And our own stockpiles are even lower on that than they are in some of these other categories of weapon systems. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, in your best estimate, from your knowledge and understanding, because you have studied Russia, what would they do if we actually used Tomahawk missiles that were fired by American military forces at targets in Russia?
They would strike back. This would be a NATO attack on Russia. That is, it would be not just using American missiles. They would be operated by American personnel. They would be using the American targeting data. They would be guided by American satellites. What do you call it? Those imagery, identification, the targeting system. Everything would be Western. At most, Ukrainian might press the button. This is not. This would be a direct war, and this is kind of my point, that we keep seeing Russia being restrained, and we're trying to conclude, why is this? And our main hypothesis is, well, they're deterred by NATO. They do not dare to respond because they wouldn't want to risk World War III. But the alternative, of course, they don't want World War III. But if you listen to Putin's comments in Valdai, he was also making the point. He was going into the numbers, saying, listen, we are winning. The Ukrainians are taking higher and higher casualties. Their ability to replenish the ranks that capability is reducing. So it's just a matter of time before there's no army anymore that can even manage these weapons. So the army is being destroyed. When there's no army, there's no war. And for this reason, they don't want to rock the boat too much, because they see escalation now is not in our interest. We're winning anyways. This is the source. This is the reason why they're acting restrained, because they're losing in the current. Now they're winning in the current format. However, if you would start to do long-range strikes deep into Russia, hitting manufacturing, hitting energy centers or political targets, the idea that they would say, oh, well, I guess we're losing now, this is, unfortunate. No, the calculation would end. They would strike back. I mean, I think...
And when you say strike back, what is the possibilities, the range of possibilities that they might strike?
Well, first of all, they have other weapons and other targets. The other weapons would, for example, be the Oreshniks, which would bring mass destruction. And they wouldn't just hit Ukraine. I think they would start to go after European targets as well. And... possibly American also. So this is incredibly dangerous. Well, they will probably go up the escalation ladder. They might use Oreshniks against key targets in Ukraine. They might use Oreshniks in Europe against countries like Germany, who doesn't have nuclear weapons. And then if it continues to escalate, they have this option. It's just the whole premise of it, that we can just start striking them directly, and somehow Russia will just capitulate. I mean, it's beyond absurd. I would like them to actually flesh out their ideas when they say this. We just have to strike them harder, be more direct, more powerful weapons. Why do we think the Russians would not respond if these weapons actually became significant on the battlefield?
I think the reason is because we haven't so far. So many of these so-called red lines were self-imposed that we just declared it was a red line for Russia. They didn't actually say it, like with tanks and artillery pieces and other kinds of support. They warned against it, but they didn't actually say a red line or so. But there seems to be something close to a red line on this one here. But let's talk me through, I guess, the thought process and the pros and cons that would have to go on in the event that it was used, that a Tomahawk was used and hit something painful, let's just say, because Russia would then be faced with this dilemma. Okay, there's not that many Tomahawks. You're going to cause some damage here. We're probably going to shoot a bunch of them down. You're going to further deplete your case. So if I don't do anything and just keep fighting in the SMO, we're eventually going to win. We can grind it down. But if I do nothing, they'll probably keep firing some of these, and maybe the pain will get a little bit more than just uncomfortable. But if I retaliate, then now all of a sudden I've got potentially, I don't know that everybody would fight against Russia, but then potentially you've got a whole bunch of countries, certainly the Baltics, maybe Poland, UK, Germany, France. They seem really eager to get in. So you could potentially, if Russia takes that course of action, actually now expand to a lot of different countries going up against them. So that would now then what do you do? Because like you said a second ago, all your calculations are now off the table for what you thought you were going down to. And that is a much, much bigger problem set. How do you see that competition going on in the thought process on Russia?
Well, I think this has been the main dilemma the Russians have been confronted with for the past 3.5 years. That is, what do you do every time the Ukrainian army begins to end up on its back foot? And NATO escalates a bit further. Keep in mind that Biden himself once said that F-16s would mean World War III. Now,
right.
That is a long time ago. Now, it's a nothing burger
Yeah, it
essentially.
didn't mean anything as it turned
Yeah.
out.
But for the Russians, they didn't go up the escalation ladder when this happened, because they were faced with a dilemma. If they do strike back at directly at NATO, then they might risk World War III. If they don't, then they will embolden NATO to continue to escalate further, because NATO will see restraint as weakness. And this is the main problem. So all the restraint now is being punished, and you see this in our papers as well. Oh, the Russians don't dare to do anything. Look what we've done. We stepped over all these imaginary red lines. But nonetheless, this is a key issue, which is they have to address in the Kremlin, which is, how do we restore our deterrent? Because in the past 3-4 years ago, at least the Europeans were quite cautious. You don't want to provoke the Russians too much. Now they're just openly talking about launching their missiles deep into Russia. We're openly talking about war with Russia. You had Ben Wallace, the former defense secretary in the UK, arguing that we have to strangle Crimea, make it unlivable. This kind of rhetoric, or the U.S. general responsible for NATO in Europe, Donahue,
Kaliningrad.
Yeah, saying, "Oh, let's invade Kaliningrad. We could do it." I mean, this is you're going to invade an actual region of Russia with over 1 million people. What are you going to do with these people? Are they going to live under NATO occupation? I mean, it's beyond absurd. What do you think Russia would do? What would America do if Russia or China tomorrow invaded California? I mean, we could do it quickly. I mean, if we take them by surprise, yeah. But what happens the day after? Do the Americans capitulate? Do they say, "Oh well, I guess we'll manage to live without California"? No, it's crazy. But this is the way we talk now. So the Russians, they're partly to blame for this, because they've let they let every escalation go unanswered, and they've been emboldening NATO. So they see this as a problem, and that they have to at some point hit back against us.
Let me ask you, in kind of the last bit of time we have here, where you see things going, because at a separate event from Valdai just a couple of days ago, I think it was called the Reunification Day, if I'm not mistaken, Vladimir Putin was given a congratulations to some of his military members, but he gave, I think, a bigger signal to anyone who's listening.
I address the soldiers and officers, the real heroes of our time, with a special feeling. I thank you for your loyalty to your motherland, for your military valor and courage, for every day of your hard combat work. I am sure that, thanks to you, the security of Russia will be reliably ensured, and the long-awaited and strong world will return to the heroic land of Donbass and Novorossiya. We are together, and this means that all our plans will be realized.
So he didn't say that we're going to just take the Donbass, which originally or early in the war was kind of like the primary objective here. He specifically mentioned Novorossiya, which includes a lot more than just the Donbass. What do you make of that comment?
Well, I think that might be the escalation coming on the Russian side, because again, it seems as if we think that the Russians don't uphold the red lines, because whenever they step across it, we pretend as if it happened in a vacuum. So, for example, we said nothing when the Russians for years and years warned against NATO expansion, do not go into Ukraine. Then 2014, they took back Crimea. We say, oh, this came out of nowhere. Well, that was a reaction. In 2022, they've been warning for 8 years, implement the Minsk agreement. Well, and then, of course, they invaded in 2022. When we sent all these weapons, they annexed these 4 oblasts of Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. So I think that this is the response they might come with soon if he continues down this path. And indeed, this is also, I mentioned before, the former advisor of Zelensky, Arestovich. He was making the point that why he would go and accept the loss of these 4 regions to Russia, because he argued, if you don't give up those 4 regions, we're going to lose 4 more. So it's not
there they are on that map right there.
Yeah, so it's not the difference between giving away 4 regions or none, this utopian idea, but it's either we lose 4 or we lose 8. And Novorossiya is essentially the historical regions of Russia which were transferred to Ukraine under the Soviet Union. everything then from Kharkov to Odessa. And this is, again, historical Russian regions. This is where the Russian speakers are. This is where most of the industries are, the resources. This is where the entire coastline is to the Black Sea. So this is also the regions which Russia would be able to hold, given that this is where the ethnic Russians are living, the Russian speakers. And so I think this is the territory that Russia might go for now. And this is the problem of refusing to negotiate with the Russians. We're not helping Ukraine. Every day they're losing more men, more territory, and they're moving towards collapse. We're entering the final stages here. And if there is collapse, Russia will then take all territories. And this is all the territories of Novorossiya. And this is the problem by continuing to promise future NATO membership, which we do.
And what do you say to those people like Macron, who last month in an interview that we showed here on this channel, literally mocked the idea that Russia could take all that stuff, of saying, look, they've only taken 1% in the last 2 years, and there's no way they're going to be able to take more of that. What do you say to that?
Well, in a war of attrition, you don't go for the territory right away, especially when the territory is heavily fortified and well defended by trained Ukrainian soldiers. In a war of attrition, you exhaust the adversary first. You don't want to pay too heavy manpower price for territory. And that's what we've seen happening. So Macron is measuring this all wrong. Why is he mentioning the percentage of territory? Why isn't he pointing out that Ukraine has had its military completely destroyed? That NATO has emptied all of their weapons depots. It's all been destroyed, all burning in Ukraine. Why don't they mention the massive manpower problem they have in Ukraine? All the people who have not just been killed or injured, but fled the country. Many defected to Russia. Others surrendered. But anyways, everyone's recognizing we don't have the weapons. We don't have the manpower. This is not controversial. Well, this is the measurements of attrition and warfare. When the Ukrainians don't have an army, then the Russians can march forward without taking many losses. And that's what you're seeing now. The front lines are moving very, very quickly now. And this is because the manpower has been reduced. This is why they didn't storm and do this human waves, which we keep accusing them of doing. So Macron is looking at it the wrong way. When the Ukrainian army collapses, Russia will take the territory it wants. And if we continue to threaten to expand NATO after this war, the only thing the Russians are hearing is, well, then we can't leave any strategic territory left because this could be used against Russia in the future. So they will strip Ukraine of 4 more territories. And for someone who would like to see Ukraine survive as a nation, be able to rebuild, it's a horrible idea. So we should sit down with the Russians today and accept that we lost this proxy war.
Yeah, and that's kind of my last question here in the last few minutes we have. Let me ask you this really difficult question to answer. If we don't escalate into a direct confrontation with Russia, and I do not take that as a given, I think that is a very real possibility, which I worry about a lot. But if we were able to, how do you think that the West could manage or navigate a case to where Russia ends up, we'll say, taking Novorossiya, because there's no negotiations to just take the 4 oblasts. Therefore, Russia will at some point, whether it's a collapse or however else, will end up taking the others, whether that's 6 months from now, 2 years from now, who can say? But at some point they come in. How do we navigate with everything that we've done? Then everybody in the world will see this powerful, most powerful NATO alliance, it's in the history of mankind, which they always say about themselves, couldn't even keep Ukraine from falling into Russians' hands eventually, and now their own arsenals are depleted. How will we manage and navigate that?
In terms of narrative, you think, or
in any term? I mean, I'm sure we would lie about it, but I mean, can we allow it to just where we'll just say we didn't lose, even though it's the territory's gone?
Well, there's different ways. One is we just move on to the next thing. So if there's a war against Iran, we can shift our focus. I mean, it was humiliating what happened in Afghanistan, but we kind of just moved on to Ukraine instead. So that's one way we often do it. Another one is to claim a victory. That is, if we say, well, Russia wanted all of Ukraine, if you remember, it's not real, but that's okay. If you say they wanted all of Ukraine, they only got 20%. In other words, we won. We were able to prevent, their military adventurism. This is, I guess, this is a fallback option, and it helps to save face, but it doesn't help us to learn anything because it's obviously it's not true, but it could be positive in the extent that if this is what's preventing us from making peace. So I'm assuming that we'll fall back on this. The Russians wanted to wipe Ukraine off the map. 80% is here. We win.
Yeah. That would be the least bad of all the awful options we would have. What percentage? Final question. What percentage would you give if you had to give a number that we end up in a conventional clash with Russia? How worried are you about that?
I think it's more likely than not at this point. The European seems overly eager now to get a war with Russia. The only thing they want is to make sure that the Americans are standing behind them. But you see these fake stories and this eagerness for war. I mean, the new thing, the drones near airports, this is the big thing in the Russian hybrid war. I mean, they're arresting people now almost on a daily basis, but there seem to be every nationality except Russians. They have Germans and Norwegians and Chinese tourists, but there's no Russians. But still, they're talking about this as if it would be a hybrid war. We're having fake stories about scrambling the plane of von der Leyen and all this, Russian jets flying for 12 minutes into Estonia. You can fly across the whole country and back again. I mean, this is a small country. None of this makes any sense. And so they're caught lying all the time, but they're just moving on to the next lie. And it's quite exhausting. But it's this eagerness now. They see that the war is being lost on the battlefield. They're looking for a way to escalate. And so I think we passed the line now where a major direct war with Russia is more likely than not.
Well, that's a pretty frightening thought, one which worries me a lot already now maybe a little bit more. But listen, one thing that's important is you've got to be able to know what the truth is. And one of the reasons why we have this channel, and we're very grateful for having you on it today, because we have a very sober, fact-based analysis that shows there is a rising danger. And if you're at least aware of that, then at least there's a possibility that we can sober up in time and start changing some policies. And for that, we're very grateful for your commentary today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we appreciate you guys too. Be sure and go to Glenn Diesen. You can find him right there on his YouTube channel. You don't have to wait for him to come back on our channel again sometime. You can go find him out. I was looking at some stuff just the other day.
Glenn, did you actually write all those books up top there?
Yeah, well, I wrote 11 books, but they've been translated to about 10 languages. So it's,
Yeah, so you can go with that too if you want to read some. I know a lot of our guys like to read stuff. But again, thank you very much for coming on. Really appreciate that. And we'll look forward to seeing you back real soon.
Excellent. Thank you.
And we thank you guys too. Really appreciate you. Be sure and join us back tomorrow again. We're going to have a lot more to say about most of these topics. And see you then on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.